Good evening, and welcome back to ParaGhoul Paranormal Discoveries from the Dark, the radio show where we dive into the shadows of Saskatchewan and sometimes across Canada to see what lies within. I'm your host, K.D. Kulpa, and I'm a horror author and paranormal researcher based here in Regina. Tonight we are going to be returning to a local haunt. This particular haunted building is here in Regina and is one of my favorite locations to visit, no matter what time of day or what time of year. So let me ask you, have you toured with the trickster Howie yet? Today we are going to be visiting a Regina favorite of mine. This building has been part of Regina's history nearly since day one of the city being formed. Like many historical buildings, it has gone through many ups and downs, as well as a few different tenants. The government house in Regina was originally built to be the official residence of the Lieutenant Governor, which is the Queen's representative for Saskatchewan, if you don't know. And since it was originally built, it has changed hands a few times due to the economic changes and needs of the city and Saskatchewan, but has since returned partly to its original use. Now, I think most people that visit the government house have heard that it is haunted by a friendly ghost by the nickname Howie. Howie is considered to be a bit of a trickster by the staff, but not out of anger or malice. Instead, he is considered to be a fun addition to the government house. Personally, I have been to the government house many times. I believe my first tour was through high school. In case you don't already know, I did grow up in Nipawin, which is here in Saskatchewan, and is north of Melfort and Tisdale. I can't recall exactly when we came to Regina for the tour, but my guess is around grade 9. I just remember that they were, in the period dress and talking and taking us through the museum. Now, once I became an adult, I have continued to visit the government house any chance I get. Whether it's to attend the annual Victorian or Christmas teas, go on the annual Halloween ghost tour, or just visit during some of their other events. And the government house has become not only a favorite of mine, but also of my family's. Now, I was also lucky enough to get a private tour of the Government House Museum back in January 2022 after they removed all the Christmas trees and decorations. So if you didn't know that, you can get, these private tours. Now, even though it was around 9:30 in the morning and the museum portion of the house was pretty much empty, we were surprised to have a small visit from Howie ourselves. But before we talk about that, let's first talk a little bit about the history behind the government house. So for that, we have to go back to 1882. Now, if you don't know, this is when the Canadian Pacific Railway was first being built across southern Saskatchewan. They had planned the route and it had been finalized from those in charge in Ontario. At the time, the territorial capital of the Northwest Territories, which, included Saskatchewan, was actually based in the Battlefords, which is where the government house was at that time. So given the importance of the railway to Western Canada, however, it was decided that the territorial capital should be moved to the growing city of Regina in 1883. With this change to the capital, a new residence had to be built for the Lieutenant Governor to live, as it was important for the royal family to have a presence in the capital of the province. What you might not know is that the government house that we know and love today here in Regina is not actually the first government house that was built in the area. Back in 1883, the first government house was actually built in an open field in the middle of the prairies. The edge of Regina was approximately 5 kilometers to the east of this site, and this was the very first residence, but was only considered temporary until something more suitable to the Lieutenant Governor could be built. Now, originally built by prefabricated buildings transported from Ontario, the residence underwent several additions by the Lieutenant Governor during the few years that they lived there. And when it was finished, it included 4 bedrooms, 2 dressing rooms, a drawing room, a dining room, a large and small kitchen, and there was a pantry, a storeroom. Eventually, even a veranda, porch, and conservatory were added to make it look more regal in appearance. Now, while living in this residence, the plans for the new government house were being created and designed, the one that we know today. And it was also chosen to be 1 kilometer closer to Regina at that time. So again, at that time, Regina actually wasn't as big as it is to now. So at that time, this government house was still being built in basically an empty field. And the plan was to try to induce a feeling of an English country estate. So they still wanted to make it seem really regal, right? The hope was that this large residence would imply a bit of an authority over the area by the lieutenant governor and the royal family that he represents. So the original building was completed construction in 1891, and it had a gardener's cottage, stables, a windmill with a well, an ice house, a hen house, and even extensive vegetable gardens. And the government house was also connected to the Regina telephone system, which would have probably been pretty impressive back then. Then throughout the early 1900s, the construction of the house didn't stop. Further additions continued to be added to the building right up until 1928. So, that's a long time of constantly being under construction. So when the construction finally stopped, the structure included a greenhouse now. They completely renovated the heating system. They added electricity and then connected it to the city's water system as the city, of course, was growing. A sun porch was also added, plus various other additions. So finally, the government house was considered, finished, I guess, only for the economy to take a turn and then the fate of the building to change. So as the economy of Saskatchewan took a turn, it was decided that the large building would be better used in other ways by the government. So in 1945, the lieutenant governor at that time actually moved out of the building. And they put all of the furniture into an auction, auctioned it off, like all of the furniture that they could. And the building was then painted white and leased to the Department of Veterans Affairs. So if you actually see the pictures from that time, which you can find if you look up, the old newspapers, you will see very white rooms filled with hospital beds as a convalescent home was opened in 1945. So this convalescent home was decided to give a place for veterans to live when they returned home from the war if they didn't have anywhere else to go. There was even an image, I believe, of the ballroom. So, if you go into the ballroom now, it looked completely different back then as all the walls were white. I think there was even some cots laid out so that veterans could sleep. Again, if you want to see some of this, you'd have to go through the old Regina newspapers between 1945 and 1957. But they also had many different events, including opening up their doors to performances to entertain the veterans. I think I even saw one that had to do with Christmas time where they actually had people come and visit, children come and visit at Christmas time to give the veterans something to look forward to, which was nice. By 1958, a new building was constructed for the veterans. I believe the one that is now still used by the government, leaving the government house empty again. Now, this time, the Department of Education decided to take over the building, and they actually turned it into an education center for adults. The building became known as the Saskatchewan House and continued to be used for education until 1977. Some of the original pieces you can actually still see in the building, such as the clock in the main hall, which you can still see in the room today. So that main clock in the hall has actually been there since pretty much the beginning. You can see it sitting there in the pictures of the convalescent home. You can see it sitting there in pictures of the school. And now it got cleaned up and it's back there again. So at least there was some pieces of furniture that got to stay. Now finally, the building became empty again in 1978. Now, by this time, of course, the condition of the building was getting poor, and there was discussion about potentially tearing it down. However, thankfully, the history of the building was considered too important to have it disappear from Regina completely. So the Saskatchewan House Committee, which actually had been formed in 1969, had been successful in their attempt to get the building declared a historical site. So it was officially declared a historical site in 1971, and after that declaration, renovations to the building actually started in 1978. And it was decided to return the main portion of the house to match the time period around when Saskatchewan became a province. So, kind of that time of 1889 to 1910. So pieces from that time period were found all over Canada and brought into the building to help recreate the look and feel of that period so that it could be a museum, representing that time period in our history. Now, as we talked about earlier, a lot of the original furniture had been auctioned off when the Lieutenant Governor left. So there wasn't much else they could do except for go around, to other museums or to other auctions and try and find materials to bring in. Although I should mention, they did have a bit of a surprise as the safe was locked when, they started doing this work. And they brought in a locksmith thinking that, it's probably empty or full of junk or whatever. But actually, it had been locked for so many years, and I guess no one thought to bother finding a locksmith before then, as a lot of the original china and silverware were actually found inside. So that portion of the museum, so I think it's in the kitchen, you can actually see a lot of the original china and silverware actually displayed. So that was somehow locked into the safe and nobody decided to look. So lucky for us, right? So the Government House Museum officially opened in 1980. And finally, in 1984, it was announced that the Lieutenant Governor would be returning to use the Government House again for official government business. Although they kept a large portion of the house as the museum, as you see it today, but the north wing did return to being a quarters to the Lieutenant Governor. And in 1999, an addition was added again, this side to the other side of the ballroom, and that's to accommodate the museum entrance, as well as to add an elevator to improve access to the second floor for museum visitors that, can't use the stairs. And of course, if you've been there, you'll see there's a little bit more, space for like hanging up your jackets or, having events and that kind of thing. Now, many people use the museum and event spaces on a regular basis, and actually that Saskatchewan House Committee would later become the Government House Historical Society as we know it today. So they put on a lot of events as well to raise money for the museum. And as I said earlier, some of my favorite annual events are put on by the Government House or these nonprofit organizations in the city, and I highly recommend checking out the location during the month of October if you can. But check it out early. I believe they're having another ghost tour this year, and tickets always seem to sell out early, so make sure you check it out. Now, let's talk a bit about the paranormal activity that has been experienced in the museum portion of the Government House. I didn't hear anything about the North Wing, as that is not included in the tour that I went on in 2022, but lots happened just within the museum itself. So this was the primary reason for my private tour. So let's get into the ghost stories. So as you enter the Government House, one of the first things you will notice is the change in the hardwood floor. The direction and age of the wood actually changes as you cross the threshold from the new building into the old building. And the museum itself, although it's old, is very warm and inviting. So you don't really expect to have a paranormal experience waiting for you around the corner. Surprisingly, there were no ghost stories linked to the ballroom. So as I said, even though the ballroom has, tends to hold many happy events, it does make you kind of wonder how many stayed in it during those years it was a convalescent home, or if it was just used for events, or what it was used for. Although perhaps those years spent in the room weren't particularly memorable for the people that were in it, so maybe they don't bother visiting as ghosts. Who knows? It is a lovely room though, so make sure you check it out. The first room that we were actually taken into in order to discuss paranormal events was in the library, which is to your right as soon as you enter the main Government House Museum part. So the library was used as a study by the Lieutenant Governor, and there's a large replica painting of Queen Victoria on the wall. So the unexplainable part of this story goes that some guests were there on a tour and did not hear the tour guide explaining the painting on the wall. So they didn't hear who it was or, the significance of it. And they whispered to the people in front of them, who is this in the painting? Like, why is this important? And right at that moment, a stack of pamphlets that had been sitting on a shelf nearby that had information on the queen and on the painting itself was knocked over onto the floor near their feet. So I don't know, perhaps a ghost was trying to help guide the tour and telling them to listen up. And then as we walk through the main hall of the house, you'll find some old furniture. So there's like an old piano. The old clock that I mentioned as being one of the few original pieces in the building. I think there's an old couch sitting there. And there's even an old chair that kind of sits under that clock. So that main hall clock that I talked about, there's an old chair that sits there. Now, apparently, the story goes that the commissioner had came into the building to find the chair was sitting in the middle of the hall. So right in the middle of the room. And after searching the rooms for other staff to, ask if it had been moved for a purpose, like maybe they were, vacuuming under it or whatever, the commissioner couldn't find anyone in the building, so returned to the hall to move it back, only to find it had turned and was now facing the opposite direction. So yeah, chills a little bit down the neck there. Also in the main hall is a table. And so that table holds the ceremonial sword. So this sword had belonged to Lieutenant Governor Hugh Monroe from 1931 to 1936. And then in 1936, the Lieutenant Governor, Archie McNabb, actually borrowed the sword instead of having a new one created. And there's even more history about the sword that you can find on the Government House website. So if you want to learn more about it, I'd recommend checking it out there. But the interesting story behind the sword actually goes beyond how it eventually ended up back in the Government House on display. It seems that someone within the museum is very particular about how the table under which the sword sits is decorated. Now, originally when they got the sword, a lace tablecloth had been placed underneath to give the table a bit of a fancier look. However, after many mornings of finding the tablecloth pulled off the table and left in a pile on the floor, the Government House staff finally decided, let's just move the tablecloth to a different table. And now since it's been moved, the tablecloth no longer gets ripped off. It no longer sits on the floor when they come in the morning, which makes them wonder if someone didn't like how the cloth looked under the sword. So now they leave the table under the sword empty to show respect to whomever is watching over it. Now, another story from the main floor. The billiard room, which is in the back corner of the museum, was an area for the men in the early 1900s to go have a cigar and talk. So at that time, women would not be allowed into the room unless they were, cleaning it because they were staff. Apparently, one night there was a commotion in the room. So the commissioner had walked in to see who was making the noise and, to try to figure out who was in the room, but the room was empty. However, the billiard balls had been moved from their usual placement because, they usually set them up a specific way, and the cues had been left on the ground. But who moved them? These are the main experiences that occur on the main floor of the museum, although I'm sure there are many more that we just haven't heard from the staff or other visitors. We had our own experience kind of on the stairs, which apparently has a few stories of its own. Typically, however, the unexplained occurrences on the stairs has to do with a statue that is displayed in kind of the corner at the middle of the stairs. So this was a piece that was not original to the house, but was bought at some point to be a decoration for the museum as it fits in the right time frame. This statue, on more than one occasion, has been found to be turned to face the wall or moved to a different location, and they can't figure out who is moving it. Now, upstairs is where the paranormal activity seems to be a little bit trickier, or maybe a bit creepier, depending on how you want to look at it. Although again, the ghosts of the Government House don't seem to want to scare you per se. It's more they just want your attention, or at least the staff's attention. So when the plumbing was still hooked up in the museum on the second floor, there were many stories that passed down through the staff of toilets flushing in the middle of the night when no one was in the room. Another one is that supposedly, so there's this copper tub in a bathroom, one of the main bathrooms on the second floor. And of course, it's not hooked up to plumbing anymore. But one morning, it was found to be full of water, even though there's no working pipes hooked up to it. It was just sitting there full of water, and they don't know how. The Government House also claims of children haunting the halls. In particular, there's a music box in the day nursery in the corner of the upstairs that has been known to just start playing by itself. Commissioners have also heard children crying late in the night, or at times they think maybe it's a cat stuck in the house, but they can never find who is making the noise. Given the many antique toys and dolls, personally, it's not surprising to hear there may be children haunting the nursery section of the house, but who knows who it could be. I'm sure there may be many other stories that you can hear about the government house if you can find the people willing to share them. As I mentioned, we were even graced by one of the ghosts while we were on a private tour. Well, at least my husband was. At the time, he was doing the video for the tour, so he was just taking B-roll. And, me and the tour guide and the commissioner were up on the second floor, and we were waiting for him. We had paused, we had been talking, but then we paused to kind of look back to see where he was. And he thought it would be great to get some video of the main floor while it was completely empty. What he didn't know was that someone's going to try to make themselves known to him at that moment. So while he's calmly and quietly scanning across the room, a loud knock hit the wall behind him. In the video, you can see him suddenly turn the camera to look at the wall and picture frames there. And it was because he said the knock was hard enough that he actually heard the picture frame shift behind him. So was Howie wanting to be in the B-roll? I think he or she was simply saying hi, or maybe that they approved that we were talking about their ghostly presence. I'm not sure. But now you may be asking, who is Howie? Like, who is actually haunting the government house? So let's quickly talk a little bit about the suspected ghost wandering the halls. Personally, I think this location is going to be difficult to pinpoint exactly who might the ghost be. Like I said, the furniture and decor in the building were all brought into the location from antique stores, museums, auctions, so the possibilities for sources are endless. Especially given that many of the dolls and the music box were not original to the house, and there's activity around them. So to me, that means ghosts have come in with those items. However, there was one person that did actually pass away in the building, and he is thought to be one of the ghosts watching over the building. So that is Howie. That is the affectionate name that has been given to this main ghost of Government House. Staff believe that Howie is actually the previous cook named Chun-Li. So Chun-Li had worked as a cook in the Government House for the Lieutenant Governors Monroe and McNabb, and he had come to Regina from China, and he lived upstairs in the servants' quarters of the building in the 1930s. So during the entire history of the building, Chun-Li is the only known person to actually pass away in the building. And it was because he had come down with pneumonia in 1938. Now, apparently Chun-Li was known to not particularly like children. It was said that he had once poured dirty dishwater on children that came to trick or treat at the government house on Halloween night. He was also known for shuffling around the house in his slippers. So although Chun-Li was known to die in the building, like I said, the types of paranormal activity experienced in the location kind of makes me think that someone else is haunting it. One of which could be maybe even a previous caretaker or a previous maid, which would explain why some of the paranormal activity has been, kind of a ghost trying to help as opposed to a ghost trying to play tricks. So since the ghosts knock over pamphlets and insist on particular decor, perhaps it was just a caretaker, or maybe it's someone related to, the original community group that was trying to save the government house. Maybe it's related to that. They just have pride in keeping up the location to their expected standard. Who knows? The other ghosts, I'm assuming, are connected to the many antique objects in the building, or perhaps someone that stayed in the convalescent home, really enjoyed the building and they returned to the location to help future generations enjoy the building. It's hard to say who could be haunting it for sure. However, there was no negativity in the space when we were there. So whoever is lurking the halls and moving around the furniture don't really seem to mean any harm to anybody. And I feel like, based on the stories I've heard anyway, they only really come out to bug the staff. They don't seem to bug people when there's lots of visitors or when there's, visitors walking through. However, I didn't talk to any visitors, so I'm not sure about that. But they do seem to enjoy company and they enjoy the building, and I can't really blame them for that because it is beautiful and the antique pieces are in great condition and there's a lot of history. So I know I'll keep returning to the place myself. So although it is haunted, the ghosts at the government house here in Regina seem to only be there to help the staff or play small tricks on them. It would appear that these ghosts are of people that just want to be around the beautiful decor and be part of the history. They don't want to, bother anyone or scare anybody. As I said earlier, my family and I love the government house, especially my kids. It is fun to go through even without the ghost stories. But they also have many different celebrations, Canada Day celebrations, Victorian tea that I mentioned. There's lots that happens at the government house. So I highly recommend that you visit it if you ever get the chance. Thank you for joining us tonight. Don't forget, if you'd like to support the show, you can find me on most social media platforms under KDKULPA. I also have a Patreon for those who want behind-the-scenes information, extra content, and a chance to join a live Q&A with me each month. Next week, we will be jumping back into the history of the paranormal and talking about some of the technology that was used, in the past as well as today, to capture evidence of ghosts and those from other realms. So stay tuned for our upcoming episodes, where we'll uncover more secrets, unravel more mysteries, and delve deeper into the shadows. Until then, remember to keep your flashlight handy and digital recorders ready. This is Katie Kulpa, signing off. Until next time, my ghouls.